Episode of Next Steps Forward, and I'm your host, Chris Meek. As always, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Next Step Forward is committed to helping others achieve more than ever while experiencing greater personal empowerment and well-being. Our guest today is Dr. Meg Tuszynski. Meg is the Managing Director of the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom and the Cox School of Business at Southern Methodist University. She is also a Research Assistant Professor at the Cox School. Meg has published research in a number of economic, public policy, and entrepreneurship journals, and her writing has been published in such popular publications as Investor's Business Daily, the Washington Examiner, the Dallas Morning News, and the Daily Caller. Dr. Meg Tuszynski, welcome to Next Steps Forward.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris. I'm thrilled to be here today.
Now, we're gonna have a lot of fun. We're gonna get deep and wonky stuff today on economic policy, so I'm really looking forward to it. So current events today remind me of the old adage, there's two sides to every story. So let's just start there. Most economists have said for quite a while that our economy is strong and resilient. But President Trump won last fall on the strength of arguing the economy was in terrible shape as consumers have been hit hard by inflation. Has our economy been like the tale of two cities, the best of times and the worst of times? And then setting politics aside, is this a situation of economists looking at the big picture while consumers judge things on their own situations?
Yeah, Chris, I think that best of times and worst of times setup is exactly a perfect way to sort of describe today's economic situation. I think what we really have going on is some competing indicators, and it's really, really easy for people who want the economy to look great and like we're flourishing to throw out one set of indicators, and people who maybe want to present a little bit more of a pessimistic story to throw out another set of indicators. And they're all kind of battling with one another. So, we have relatively low unemployment. We've had a labor market bounce back-ish since, the pandemic. Consumer spending is pretty robust, although there's some, pretty good evidence that spending isn't sort of equal throughout the different levels of the income distribution. And so we have some really good indicators. Wage growth has been pretty strong in recent years. However, the consumer confidence reports just came out this morning. For 3 months in a row, consumer confidence has been declining. Inflation is it's come down since the sort of peak at 9-10%, but it's sort of stubbornly stuck at 3%, which is below, the Fed's target of 2% inflation. And listen, I like to say that relatively wealthy consumers are going to do well in any economy, or do at least better in any economy. But where that inflation really hits hard is for poorer consumers. That's eating into their budgets. Even though real wages have risen for most people, that higher price of eggs and butter and everything is eating into wages. We've got high housing costs across different markets that is really hitting consumers. And so I think we have these two battling narratives going on at the same time, which feeds into that best of times, worst of times idea. What I will say is that I think in the grand scheme of things, like on net, the best of times narrative should win out if you take a long enough scope of human history or even recent history. We live in the best of all possible times. Maternal mortality, infant mortality is down. Life expectancy is up across all countries, even poor countries. This is an incredible human achievement that you only recognize if you take a step back and look at that long scope of human history. But I don't think it's inconsistent to say that we live in the best of times. We can do better, and we should do research into figuring out how to do better, which is where I kind of have plugged myself into my career.
I want to touch on two specific items you mentioned a moment ago in terms of consumption goods. First, you mentioned eggs. We've got the bird flu going on right now. And so, you're seeing eggs go from anywhere from $7 to $15 a dozen across the country. And you don't realize it, but eggs are in everything. Yeah. I know that's just a one-off piece of information in terms of, you mentioned, eggs, milk, bread, butter, et cetera. But how is something like that affecting, say, the average or lower income or wage earner's pocketbook?
Yeah, that is such a tough one. Eggs are in everything. You'd like to think as an economist, we talk about substitutes a lot. Well, it's easy enough to just have oatmeal for breakfast instead of eggs, but eggs are in so much. And so this higher price of eggs is really problematic. I don't know if there's a good policy prescription that will easily be able to bring that down. We're talking about vaccinating birds, but then there are worries that if we vaccinate them, we won't be able to sell those eggs, or producers are worried they won't be able to sell those eggs in other countries because of different rules. And so, that's just a really, really tough one, and is eating into, in addition to all of the other increases in prices that are eating into particularly low income consumers' budgets. I mean, eggs are certainly a big part of that.
And I just want to touch on the housing market briefly. And again, I know it's sort of a one-off item. And you talked about how home prices are getting higher, but we've seen the Fed, raise interest rates for the last couple of years. There have been a couple of cuts recently. They're on hold for now. But now as we're seeing these monthly home sales come out, they're starting to drop a little bit because of those higher mortgage rates. Right. Do you think, and again, crystal ball, I'm not going to hold you anything here, will home prices come down a bit, as the Fed sort of is in this holding pattern for a while, or do you think that they'll kind of be stabilized, expecting the Fed to cut rates to potentially sometimes later this year?
So there is some discussion about the Fed potentially being able to cut rates. However, one of the reasons that rates have stayed so high for so long is because we've had this persistent sort of sticky inflation that we've had to deal with. And so unless we get the inflation problem under control, the Fed's not going to easily be able to continue cutting those interest rates, which then will feed into, higher than average mortgage rates. I think the other big problem that we have that's going to exacerbate the inability of Fed to cut rates because of that persistent inflation problem is the fact that there are these tariff discussions going on. And so, tariffs on net tend to harm consumers more than they harm producers. That'll create higher prices for everything if they go into effect as I don't even want to say anticipated. There's a lot going on in these tariff discussions. But if these tariffs do go into effect, by one estimate, the average American household will pay about $1,200 more in 2025 for all of their goods than they did in 2024 because of those tariffs. And so I think housing prices, while we see them coming down a little bit in some markets, I don't think we're going to return to sort of a pre-pandemic housing market. And so that's tough. That's really going to be a tough pill to swallow for consumers who want to live the American dream and buy their own home and do all of these things.
Our conversation this week is very timely because the Stanford Graduate School of Business just this past weekend shared some information about the global economy from one of its finest professors. He said the world financial system is very US-centric. He also said, quote, particularly when it comes to payment systems or the clearing of transactions and payments, there isn't really a viable alternative that the US doesn't either own or indirectly control, end quote. First, do you agree with that perspective? And second, what does that mean in practical terms for our country, other countries, and everyday Americans?
Yeah, so with respect to the payment system, that's we have a lot of other countries that rely on the US dollar as either a reserve currency or they peg their currency to the US dollar. And so, yeah, I think that's absolutely an important issue. Yeah.
And tariffs, as you mentioned, have been in the news a lot since President Trump began his second term. That same professor I just mentioned describes tariffs as one form of geoeconomics. And he said geoeconomics are, quote, essentially that middle ground between really expensive threats, like the threat to invade a country or to start a war, and purely soft arguments, end quote. From your perspective, are the tariffs or the threat of tariffs so far from President Trump closer to declaring war on some countries, closer to soft arguments, or somewhere in the middle?
I think what is really important to keep in mind in all of these conversations, these sort of public conversations we're having about tariffs, is there are a few different tariff conversations going on. So not all tariffs are created equally. And so in one bucket of tariffs, you have these sort of what I'll call maybe strategic tariffs on the proposed tariffs on Canada and Mexico, for example. Those seem by all accounts to be sort of posturing because President Trump wants to get something else, wants to have control of the border, wants to get a handle on the fentanyl crisis. And so he's using tariffs as a tool to try to get these other sorts of concessions. That's problematic because that hurts consumers in those countries and in our countries who are subject to those tariffs. It's important always to keep in mind that we talk about tariffs as being imposed by one country on another country. But in reality, those are tariffs that are imposed on some specific set of consumers and producers in those countries. And so by using tariffs as a way to get other sorts of concessions, there are other policy tools that you have at your disposal to get those sorts of concessions without imposing some sort of harm on a set of consumers who's not privy to those sorts of conversations. We have another bucket of tariffs that are meant to protect domestic industry, or for national security type purposes. These are things like pharmaceuticals and semiconductors and steel and aluminum tariffs. And so that's a whole nother set of tariffs. But even those are problematic because we do import a lot of steel and aluminum, but not always just as an end product. So auto manufacturers, for example, are very, very concerned about the threat of these tariffs. If they don't have some sort of carve outs, they're very, very worried that their industries may become less competitive because of the higher prices that will be passed on to them due to the tariffs on those inputs that they rely upon. And then, a third set of tariffs that are being explored right now. Trump just earlier this week said he sort of tasked some of his federal agencies with exploring the possibility of reciprocal tariffs. And so those are tariffs, because another country imposes tariffs on us, the idea that we should impose equal tariffs on them. But Doug Irwin is a sort of economic historian in the Wall Street Journal earlier this week, had a great piece where he said, just because another country has an ill-advised trade policy with respect to tariffs doesn't mean we should change our trade policy to be an ill-advised trade policy with respect to tariffs. And so we live in this wonderful, beautiful, interconnected world. I do worry. Your question started asking about, is this sort of geoeconomics? One thing I do worry about, specifically with tariffs on some of our friends and our neighbors, is that we're going to disrupt the sort of balance of trade that we have enjoyed in past years and sort of make our friends and allies upset with us because we're not engaging with them economically.
And we saw that firsthand last week when it was the USA Canada hockey game, right. and they booed during the national anthem up in Montreal.
Yeah,
so they certainly
in the first 9 seconds of that game.
Yeah. So they certainly voiced their opinion on that. So as he talks about tariffs, President Trump insists we're going to have more money in the Treasury than we know what to do with. And from his lips to God's ear on that one. But on the other hand, many economists and business leaders are saying everything from clothes to food to new cars is going to cost more. Sort out the likely impacts with tariffs for us. You mentioned the $1,200 on average before. Is there anything more to it than that? Or is it just sort of across the board as the best guess?
Yeah, so I'm just going to steal the rest of our conversation and talk about the likely impacts of tariffs. Now, I'm of course kidding, but there's a lot going on here. So this is going to be kind of a bird's eye overview. So tariffs raise the price of things that we import. Put a tax on them that's going to raise the price of the things that we import. It doesn't matter who is actually writing the check to the government. We're levying those tariffs on foreign producers. But if we as Americans value those goods and services, they're going to pass those price increases along to us, making the prices for our goods higher. Now, if other countries don't have sort of retaliatory tariffs or tariffs on our goods, that lowers the relative price of our exports. So exporters love tariffs, importers, not so much. And so that raises the price of things we buy, lowers the relative price of things we sell, but there are many, many more consumers in the US than there are producers. So on net, Americans will be worse off because they'll be left with paying a higher price for goods and services. I mentioned earlier that, estimate that consumers will be on the hook. American households will be on the hook for about $1,200 more paying for their goods and services. When Trump passed tariffs on manufactured goods during his last administration, there is, at least by one estimate, he saved 1,000 U.S. manufacturing jobs at the expense of about 75. When he passed tariffs on steel and aluminum during his previous administration, that saved about 1,000 U.S. manufacturing jobs at the expense of about 75,000 U.S. manufacturing jobs that were heavily reliant on those products. And so that's extremely, extremely problematic. The last point I'll say on this, in my bird's eye overview, Bob Dylan had a great song called Union Sundown. And he has this line in it where he says, if it's cheaper to, when it costs, I'm going to butcher this, but when it costs too much to build it at home, you just build it someplace else. The corollary to that is if you bring some of that back home, it's going to cost more to build those things at home. And so those are going to be some of the likely impacts that we will see if those tariffs go into effect as they're being discussed. But like I said, some of these tariff proposals are just sort of posturing or a tool to try to get some sort of other policies in effect.
It's been a long time since I took micro and macroeconomics, but 1,000 jobs versus 75,000 jobs, that's pretty simple math.
Simple math, very simple math.
Okay, just making sure didn't forget
it's still good.
My curves on that one.
Yes.
So as you look at the U.S. economy today, what do you think is more important to our long-term economic freedom? Tax cuts, or not just reducing annual deficits, but also reducing the national debt?
Both are important. What I like to say, particularly when I'm talking to my students, is that what's really important isn't one or the other, but having these sorts of conversations at the same time. So very often we have conversations about tax policy over here, and we have conversations about spending policy or deficit policy or the national debt over here on a different plane. We tax in order to spend, or we go into deficit financing in order to spend, which is what we've been doing increasingly lately. But I think having those conversations together is really, really important. So I loved during the first Trump administration when my taxes were cut. That was wonderful. And there are reasons, really good economic reasons why tax cuts are beneficial. Tax cuts on producers are beneficial because they can invest more in their business, maybe pay their employees more. Tax cuts on consumers means there's more money in consumer pockets so they can save or spend, use that money the way that they would like to. However, if you're cutting taxes without getting that spending beast under control, what you're really doing in effect is just sort of passing the buck, pushing more of that debt out into the future. And I've got 2 young kids. I am very worried about what sort of the future looks like if we keep up on the spending path that we are on. It is very politically attractive to cut taxes. It's not so politically popular to take away benefits, but we're going to have to confront this debt crisis sooner or later, and sooner is really the answer there. So the estimates vary, but sometime within the next decade, we are going to hit a point where interest on the debt outpaces our ability to continue spending on the programs for which we gathered that debt in the first place. And so before the interest bill starts coming due in a big way, we should get that spending under control. Now, Trump claims that, part of the reason for the tariffs is, as you said, we're going to flood the treasury with money, and part of it's going to come from these tariffs. Estimates that I've seen just don't allow that, don't support that contention. And so really getting that debt under control before you cut taxes, I think is really key. But having those conversations together and forcing policymakers and consumers and voters to realize that these two things work hand in hand is really, really crucial.
You talked about the national debt. And for those people who have been to Midtown Manhattan, the north side of Penn Station, there's a sign, I forget who sponsors it, but it's a digital sign, real time. It just keeps calculating the national debt.
Yeah.
And so if you go back a week later or a month later and you look like, oh my God, it's changed that much already. And so it's just real time. It's nauseating to watch the numbers spin and cycle. And so to your point, you worry for our children.
Yes, absolutely. And it's real money. When you start talking about billions, it's hard for people to wrap their mind around billions, trillions, like these large numbers. But that's real money that we're not going to be able to continue, just continue adding to the debt indefinitely.
You can't kick the can down the road forever.
Correct.
Meg, your research interests fall into 2 primary categories. The first works to understand the causes and consequences of variations in economic freedom across nations, states, and localities. The second seeks to advance our understanding of the ways in which market and government actors are interlinked. The latter is called entangled political economy. So let's start with economic freedom. How do you define economic freedom?
Great question. So at my institute, the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom, we have the lead author of three indices, the lead authors of three indices on economic freedom. So Dean Stansel and Ryan Murphy work on this index that rates and ranks countries in terms of how economically free they are, which I'll define in a second. We have Dean Stansel, who works on the Economic Freedom of North America Index, and then a Metropolitan Area Economic Freedom Index that rates and ranks US states, and then another that Metro Index rates and ranks US metropolitan areas. And so essentially the way that we think about economic freedom is how closely a country or a state or a metro area resembles sort of the textbook idea of what we think of as being a free market. So how conducive the policies and the institutions of a country or a state or a metro area are to creating that sort of a market environment, allowing people to make economic decisions sort of free from government interference, as long as they don't trample upon the equal rights of others. And so this is a really, really cool project that's been going back sort of kickstarted by Milton Friedman and other prominent economists in the late 80s and early 90s. The first index of economic freedom was released in 1996. And so we have decades of research now that is looking into the implications of economic freedom. If a state or a country is more economically free, does it grow faster? Yes. Experience lower levels of poverty? Yes. Realize a broad variety of normatively good outcomes. And so that's really the world that I'm plugged into, is trying to understand those implications of economic freedom.
And sometimes it's difficult to make academic research relevant to the layperson, which is why your job is not an easy one. How does economic freedom affect our personal lives? Is there a correlation between higher levels of economic freedom and better mental or physical health?
So as I mentioned, this research has been going on since the 90s. And so we do have literally hundreds of papers now. And so my colleagues and I, in a couple of different papers, looked at all the papers on sort of the cross-national economic freedom using the Economic Freedom of the World Index. We have another paper that looks at all of the literature we could find that uses the Economic Freedom of North America Index, and then relates it to whatever good outcome, like pick your favorite good outcome. And there has been a study on economic freedom and how it is related to that outcome. Economic freedom is unsurprisingly related to more robust economic indicators, like, as I mentioned, economic growth, but a variety of different labor market, indicators. Places that are more economically free tend to see more people participating in the labor market. They tend to see lower rates of unemployment, fewer people in deep poverty. But there are other, softer indicators that have also been examined with respect to economic freedom. So, you mentioned health. There are papers on economic freedom and health. There are papers on economic freedom and happiness. There's some suggestion, or some evidence rather, that places that are more economically free, people tend to be happier. One really cool one that I like is economic freedom and tolerance. There is some evidence based on research that places that are more economically free, residents tend to be more tolerant. One really cool project that I was involved in, and still am to some extent, is looking at the impact of economic freedom on women in particular. And across the US states, places that are more economically free, women are having closer to the number of children that they say they want to have. There's this gap between the number of children that women say they would like to have ideally and the number of children they actually end up having. And so a couple of colleagues of mine studied that fertility gap and found that women are having closer to the number of children they want to have. And so another thing that I like to tell my students is, you may not care about economic freedom for its own sake. You may not care about lower taxes, lower government spending, lower regulations. but you probably care about something that economic freedom is related to. You probably care about tolerance. You probably care about happiness. You probably care about life expectancy or maternal mortality. Whether women are able to have access to education. Maybe you care more about entrepreneurship. There have been all of these studies that have found that economic freedom, by and large, is related to these good things with very, very few drawbacks. So my colleagues and I coded all of the papers in terms of, is it related to a good outcome? Just sort of nothing that pops, no outcome that we can discern, or related to a negative outcome. And in the majority of studies, economic freedom was related to some normatively good outcome with very few drawbacks.
Where does the United States rank globally in terms of economic freedom? Which countries are the top, at the bottom? The ones whose rank, good or bad, might surprise us.
So I should take a step back and say that when we're looking across countries and measuring economic freedom, we have 45 indicators that all come from third-party sources like the IMF and the World Bank, very reputable third-party sources. So that we're not creating our own data. We don't want people to be able to point to us and say, oh, you've just sort of, put the countries that you really like on top. No, we have this method. It's very clear for all to see exactly what we're doing, and we just update the numbers every year. And so we are looking, when we're looking across countries, at things like size of government. We're looking at the legal system and property rights, how well they support liberty. We're looking at sound money. That's an area where the U.S. has not been doing so well in recent years. Inflation, for example. We are looking at free trade. This is an area where the U.S. really hasn't been doing well in recent years. And we're looking at regulations of business and labor and credit. So all of that, and there's a gender adjustment, by the way. So we, in 2017, incorporated the fact that across countries, there are many countries where men and women don't have the same real experienced economic freedom. The real economic freedom of a woman in Sudan is not the same as the real economic freedom of a man in Sudan. In many countries, women can't open a bank account without a man's permission, or work without their husband's permission. All of these different things, and so we've incorporated that into our index. With that said, U.S. currently ranks 5th on the index. As I said at the very beginning, it's not inconsistent to say we're doing really well, but we could be doing better on these different areas. So we rank 5th out of all of the countries that we rank here. The top 5 are Hong Kong. We are only looking at economic freedoms, not personal freedoms. My colleague Ryan Murphy also does a human freedom index, and Hong Kong falls pretty dramatically there. But Hong Kong, Singapore, Switzerland, and New Zealand are the other 4 that round out the top 5. And then, of course, we're 5th. Where we do pretty well is in our legal system and our protection of property rights. We do pretty well, actually, in terms of regulation. This is compared to other countries. Just looking within our country, regulations are, as we've seen in recent news, a little bit out of control. But compared to other countries, we actually perform pretty well on that metric. We have been doing increasingly poorly in terms of freedom to trade internationally since at least the 90s. Our score in that category has been going down and down and down. And so, we talked about tariffs earlier. We're not imposing tariffs on a sort of wild west of free trade that's currently existing. We're imposing tariffs on a U.S. that already has a pretty constrained trading environment. You also asked about our bottom dwellers and in a country that might surprise you. So I had to write these down. I've got, which also might not surprise you, the ones that rank in the bottom: Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Sudan, Syria, and Algeria. We either don't have data or we don't trust the data for North Korea and Cuba. But if we did, they would be at or very, very close to the bottom. The country I like to highlight as an amazing, very surprising country is the Republic of Georgia. They left the Soviet Union in 1991 and had some really turbulent, rocky years, like many of the countries, post-Soviet countries. But in 2003, they experienced a peaceful revolution, the Rose Revolution, that swept into power a government that was very committed to essentially putting in place very free market policies and institutions. And they currently rank, I think, 20th or 21st on our index, up from, I don't know, ranking very poorly about in the early 2000s and beforehand. So that's a really cool example of what can happen when you accept this ideology of economic freedom and really put it into practice.
It's fascinating to me, again, putting my wonky economics hat on. We've only been talking about economic freedom, and there's so many other different factors that go into policy and economics in general. And so I think just the general person on the street doesn't think about all these things on a daily basis in terms of what tariffs are going to do to them, or a trade war, or a war itself. And so it's just, I appreciate you taking the time to educate us on some of the things that make our everyday lives kind of go around in the economic world.
Sure.
And then sticking with that, does economic freedom help individuals and businesses adapt better to economic downturns or crises?
Absolutely. Like I said, we've got a ton of research on economic freedom and all sorts of different things. So whether we are looking at natural disasters, financial crisis, so there's literature in all of these on the relationship between economic freedom and recovery from natural disasters, recovery from financial crises, and recoveries from something like a pandemic. And in all three of those crisis situations, there is a suggestion or some literature to support the idea that places that are more economically free tend to recover more quickly and see more robust recoveries. And this is for a couple of reasons. And one of the biggest reasons is that when you are somewhere where that is relatively free economically, entrepreneurs tend to feel a little bit safer in taking big risks. And when you're recovering from some sort of a crisis, the ability to take big risks is really, really important. And so, economic freedom not only helps places have the infrastructure in place that's going to help them outgrow a crisis a little bit more easily, but also allows entrepreneurs to feel comfortable taking those sorts of risks. And so I have, friends that have looked at the recovery from the hurricanes in Joplin, recovery from Katrina, friends who have looked at the recovery from the pandemic. And there's just very, very clear evidence that places that went in with a high level of economic freedom performed better in these scenarios than places that went in with a low level of economic freedom. And that places that improved tended to also do better.
All right, let's cast a wider net now, besides just economic freedom. Let's dive into the entangled political economy. When we say entangled political economy, are we basically talking about how government policies and regulations influence our economy? What do we mean by entangled political economy?
Yes, so this is a phrase that was coined by my dissertation advisor, Richard Wagner. And it's kind of it's absolutely a jargony phrase, but essentially what it means is that I can point to very few examples of a truly free market enterprise that is unencumbered by some sort of government relationships or regulation. And so the sort of reason I've gravitated to studying this idea of entangled political economy is really related to my research on economic freedom. I think markets, when they work and they are sort of not weighed down by government restrictions, are wonderful and beautiful things. And they allow consumers to get the goods they desire, and they allow producers, to be entrepreneurial and to come up with big ideas. But I can point to very few examples of a truly free market. And what I've realized over the years in having conversations with, particularly with students, but with others who I might not agree with on the issues, is that very often we're talking past one another. I say markets are wonderful and it's government that's messing everything up. And they say markets are terrible. We need government to step in and correct the failures that we are seeing in markets here. And what the entangled political economy framework really does is say we're both right in some sense, but both wrong in another sense. We're not looking at truly free markets. You take high CEO pay as a really good example here. When CEOs have made money because they have created a good or a service that consumers value, that is laudable. That is amazing. And I think they deserve, the money that they're, consumers have voted with their dollars, and that CEO pay, that pay has funneled into their pockets. But if CEOs have made a lot of money because they've had cozy relationships with the regulators and have been able to get some beneficial regulations or tax breaks or something to that effect, well, then maybe not all of their pay is really truly generated in a free market. And so what the entangled political economy idea is really doing is saying we can have more productive conversations with people who really fundamentally don't agree with one another. By taking from our starting point, we're not talking about a free market, a totally free market. And I came out with a book late last year with Richard Wagner on this idea. And my takeaway from a lot of this research is that if we start from that assumption, it's much easier to make the argument that, listen, markets aren't perfect, but government solutions often are the medicine is worse than the disease. They're not correcting what they're meant to be correcting in many cases. And so I think starting from that starting point of markets and government actors are entangled opens us up to a more fruitful conversation that I think leads us back to a better conversation of how we can return to a world that's more dominated by markets.
You just said a phrase that I don't think I've heard in 2 decades, if not more. We can have productive conversations on things we disagree on. What a novel idea.
Right? Yes.
And before I forget, you mentioned the book you wrote. What's the title of the book, and where can our viewers and listeners find that?
Oh, what did we land on? Reason, Ideology, and Democracy, a study in entangled political economy. It's a very, very academic book. My project right now is working on sort of a more consumer-friendly version of that, where I work through different specific markets and say, let's look at healthcare. And instead of yelling at each other about markets versus government, we look at the entanglement and see if we can have a more productive conversation forward. Let's look at the housing market. Let's look at education. And so the book that I had is a lot more academic. The next one will be a lot more consumer friendly.
Perfect. I appreciate that. So what are the biggest threats to economic freedom in the U.S. today?
I really think, and I know I'm going to be just sound like I'm beating the same old drum, but I think it is the threat of tariffs. It is the threat of unfreeing our trade. As I mentioned, that is the area. We have those 5 areas of economic freedom that we divide our 45 indicators into when we're looking across countries. We actually do pretty well on regulations. We have not been doing so. We do pretty well on government spending, not great, but better than some other countries. What's really hurting us is we've seen big declines in our sound money rating in recent years. So a lot of that's driven by the policies that have exacerbated or continued these inflation problems that we've been experiencing. And then the threat to free trade, I think, is probably the biggest threat to economic freedom. We live in an interconnected world. And so, we should do what we do best and trade for the rest. And, some of it's sad when we lose American jobs. It really is. I am from a very small town in Illinois that used to be very dependent on manufacturing. We had a chemical plant, Velsicol Chemicals. We had a plastics manufacturing company, Cadillac Plastics. Those have all left within the past few decades. And it's not been great for my small Illinois town. But what's really wonderful about free trade is it frees up American labor to go and do other things. We hit our peak of manufacturing in like the late 70s when over 30% of the American workforce was employed in manufacturing. It's now like 7-ish%. We don't have 23% unemployment. People have gone on to do other things because we don't have a thriving manufacturing sector in Paris, Illinois, I'm not there anymore. I'm pursuing a totally different route in my career. And so that's what I worry about as one of the largest threats to economic freedom is, and I know it's not a word, but unfreeing our trade. It already, as I mentioned, has been declining since the 90s. And really putting more restrictions on free trade, it's just not good for anyone, and it's really bad for economic freedom.
You made a good segue there, talking about your career in Illinois versus pursuing your career now in Dallas. At the beginning of the show, we jumped right into the big economic issues. What attracted you to a career focused on economic freedom, and how did you become the managing director of the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom?
I had just a great deal of luck when I was in high school. My parents owned a restaurant. We had a gentleman who would come into the restaurant, who at the time was the chairman of the board of an educational philanthropic group called Liberty Fund. And I started working for him during high school, and he would give me this remedial reading for the week that would be, Hayek's Road to Serfdom, the Freeman magazine and Reason magazine. And so I really fell in love with some Mises stuff. So I really fell in love with the ideas of free markets and limited government and personal responsibility in high school. And so I, went to him my senior year and said, well, where do I go to study these ideas further? So I ended up at George Mason University, which is sort of a mecca for free market ideas. I worked with some really, really great people. I mentioned Dick Wagner, but also Peter Bettke and Virgil Storr while I was at George Mason. And I was exposed during that time to this Economic Freedom of the World Index and the Economic Freedom of North America Index. And so I was working on my PhD, and my husband and I decided we wanted to move to be closer to family. And so just so fortuitously, there was a job opening at Southern Methodist University at what then was called the O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom. And I emailed them and said, I just am in love with the work that you do. I would love to have a job here. And so that's how I ended up at the Bridwell Institute. And I just love it. I get to solve academic puzzles all day. I get to, and not just solve puzzles, but actually solve puzzles in a way that helps other people. It's incredible. It's a dream job.
So you're in high school reading magazines on economic policy and free markets, and I was reading Sports Illustrated magazine. So I think this shows a big difference between the two of us here.
Sure.
And before I forget also, where can people learn more about what you do at the Bridwell Institute?
Yeah, so you can, we are on X, the artist formerly known as Twitter. We're also on Facebook. And we don't have a catchy URL, but just Google the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom. We're at Southern Methodist University. And all the data that I've been talking about, this is a wonderful URL, freetheworld.com. The Fraser Institute is the publisher of this data. And so freetheworld.com, you've got all of the world data, you've got all the North American data, these really cool interactive maps. And so that's where you can find out if you're interested in knowing where your city or where your country ranks, go to freetheworld.com for that.
And again, it's like you're reading my notes. Great segue again. We were talking about the global economy in different countries earlier. Does economic freedom differ from state to state, and what factors create those differences?
So I kind of mentioned what goes into our Economic Freedom of the World Index. Obviously, something like sound money or freedom to trade internationally doesn't vary across states. And so when we're looking at economic freedom across the states, we're looking at 10 indicators divided into tax policies related to government spending, and then various different sorts of labor market regulations in calculating our economic freedom scores across states. And yes, you might think that we're all one big nation, but there are significant and substantial variations across states. And so, yes, I mentioned I'm from Illinois. I would love to live in Illinois. My husband and I actively debated whether we should live in Indiana. I wasn't actually going to live in Illinois, but for economic freedom reasons, to be perfectly honest, but between Illinois and Texas, and decided to move to Texas. Texas is, what are we, third, fourth, fifth? We're fifth this year in terms of economic freedom. New Hampshire is first out of the states. And so in the early 2000s, a bunch of people who loved the idea of economic freedom said, let's move to a really small state and see how free we can make it. So that's why New Hampshire is the free state. So almost by design, it's perennially at the top of our index. Then you've got South Dakota, Florida, Tennessee, and then Texas are at the top. Unsurprisingly, New York, California, Hawaii, West Virginia, and Vermont, New Mexico, these are all sort of the perennial bottom dwellers in terms of economic freedom. And, when you mention, well, we are all the United States, but what are the implications of these variations in economic freedom across states? If you look at, for example, a map of net migration, how many people are going into or leaving a state, and you overlay that on a map of economic freedom, it's really of our economic freedom across the state. It's really incredible. It's so closely correlated. People don't want to live in states that are economically punishing, not because they're looking at our maps, not because they're looking at our data and being, rational economic calculators. It's because they feel the pain of economic unfreedom and realize the benefits of economic freedom. Really cool. We look at a couple times a year, one of us in our network will end up writing something on, U-Haul and United Van Lines. These will release their indices of where people are moving or how expensive it is to move from one place to another. And, you can really see in real time, it's a lot more expensive to rent a U-Haul in Dallas, Texas, and drive it to, San Francisco than it is to rent a U-Haul in San Francisco. Or it's a lot more expensive to rent a U-Haul in San Francisco and drive it to Dallas because everybody is trying to move to Dallas. Nobody's wanting to move to San Francisco. And those are economic freedom reasons. Again, I go back to Illinois. Chicago used to be one of the places to do business in the US. Businesses have been flooding out of California and Illinois and New York in recent years. And they've been coming to places like Florida and Texas and Tennessee because we are environments that are conducive to economic prosperity. And those other places were all very prosperous once, but they've in many ways killed the goose that laid the golden egg.
I think I read yesterday that Apple just announced they're going to build a plant in Houston, I believe.
Yeah.
And, so I live in the great state of Connecticut, or the People's Republic of Connecticut, depends on how you want to phrase it. I'm afraid to ask where we rank as a state. But to your point, we've seen two things here. One from my local town in Stamford. This is about 10 or 15 years ago, one of the largest hedge funds in the world. Actually, I think the largest, Bridgewater, which is a few towns over from us, a couple $100 billion in AUM. They were looking to put their headquarters in Stamford. The mayor of Stamford said, fine, but here's the taxes you're going to have to pay to come here. So they said, fine, and GOTS will stay up where they are in Westport. But then maybe about 7 or 10 years ago, General Electric was looking to renegotiate their deal with the state. And the governor wouldn't budge, wouldn't give them the cuts they were looking for. They said, fine. What'd they do? They moved their global headquarters to Boston. So two great economic decisions there here in the great state / People's Republic of Connecticut.
Yes.
There's an argument, not all unwarranted or irrational, that businesses would do all sorts of bad things if they are completely unregulated. What's the right balance between too much red tape and regulation and just the right amount of regulation? Is there a Goldilocks solution?
I think, I mean, the cop-out answer is that less is generally preferred to more. When you've reached over-regulation, less is preferred to more. There were a couple of really cool reports. One that the World Bank used to put out what was called the Doing Business Index. And there was was it Arizona State University did one for a while called Doing Business in North America that looked at basically the real economic costs businesses face when they are choosing to locate in different places. So that's, those economic costs could include things like how many days it takes to open a new business, how many regulatory steps you have to go through, the permitting process, the cost, all of these different things. And where regulations surrounding starting a new business were lesser, unsurprisingly, more businesses were starting. When it costs less to do a thing, people will do more of that thing. regulation is a cost on business. And so clearly there are some regulations that are important. We don't want to live in a world of no regulation. That's a charge I've gotten levied against me sort of in the past when I've had these conversations. Not saying that you are at all, but something that I do get pushback on sometimes is like, well, are you just saying we want to live in the total Wild West, unregulated world? Well, the answer is clearly no. But we have reached a point where we are so regulated, you can't do anything as a business without running afoul of some sort of regulation, whether you know it or not in many cases. And so I don't know if there is a Goldilocks solution. What I do know is that there is research that says when businesses begin to find it really, really costly to do business in a state or in a country, they will do less business there and move to places where it is less costly for them to do those things. The last thing I'll say on this is regulation can come from various different places. We often talk about regulation that comes from the government. However, consumers are the very important factor in the equation of making sure businesses aren't doing things that they should not be doing. And so businesses would not continue moving to Florida and Texas if we were just wantonly flaunting regulation, right? Like we are staying ahead of the things that help producers and consumers feel safe in their jobs and in their businesses, but cutting the sort of unnecessarily bureaucratic red tape that really clogs down, particularly small businesses. My parents own a restaurant in Illinois, and it's not so costly for a really big chain restaurant to stay in compliance and to stay on top of all of the regulations and the different requirements that are coming down the pike. It's really costly for a one-off small business to have to dedicate, my parents are the two people who also work in the office of our small family restaurant. It's really costly for them to have to take out a couple days a week in order to deal with compliance issues. And so, that's another big problem. When you've got a lot of regulation, it's really, really costly for small entrepreneurs to behave in an entrepreneurial fashion.
Dr. Meg Tuszynski, Managing Director of the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom and the Cox School of Business at Southern Methodist University, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
I really hope you'll come back and give us an update in terms of what happens or doesn't happen with these tariffs. I got through about half my material with you today, so would love to have you back on the show. And again, you get wonky and dive into the policy here. I'm Chris Meek. We're out of time. We'll see you next week, same time, same place. Until then, stay safe and keep taking your next steps forward.
Thanks.